Stevonnie is a fusion that is, most of the time, fun as hell. Every song associated with the character is stellar, some of the best choreography the show has to offer is attached to them. In general, the aesthetics of this combination between Steven and Connie just make every scene containing them an undeniable blast to watch. None of that, however, stops the show from occasionally reveling in just how horrifically uncomfortable this experience can be for those within it, both in a grander metaphorical sense, as well as in the most literal ways imaginable. At least initially though, it'd probably be more accurate to describe the character's existence as comforting, a respite from Steven's struggle to fuse with his fellow gems by finding an easier outlet with Connie. There's this joy throughout the first half of Alone Together that won't exist within the fusion for quite a while, a type of ecstasy only achievable through, well, ignorance for what judgment is to come. It's obviously not an accident that Stevonnie is happiest before they allow themselves to be perceived by others, something that's pretty consistent throughout their intermittent existence. A microcosm of this is seen even before what I would describe as the first bit of conflict in the episode, as Pearl responds to Stevonnie by almost immediately calling for the disbanding of the fusion. By the time we see Pearl and Stevonnie interact again, about 3 seasons later, this sentiment will have all but dissipated, but it's still pretty easy to trace his lineage throughout at least the remainder of this episode. Garnet, however, has a retroactively, predictably different take on things, describing Stevonnie as more accurately an experience shared between two individuals rather than a completely separate being. Before Garnet will bow out of the episode, along with the rest of the gems, she gives her fellow fusion one piece of advice.
Now, go have fun!
Something that ends up being a tad more complicated than she made it sound. Before then, though, we do get one final euphoric display from the character, something that, on rewatch, is hard not to see for its stark contrast against what is to come. And while I do understand this video is probably not titled something like Stevonnie and the horrors of having a good time, it would feel more than disingenuous to pretend that this part of the fusion's time in existence isn't just as important as what is to come. On top of all of that though, this might just be the most aesthetically pleasing sequence the show ever strings together, with this gorgeous piece of music that I wish copyright would allow me to play, and some genuinely stunning use of color that copyright is hopefully allowing me to play. Given how heavy the remainder of this one is, this moment of levity not only allows the episode a chance to breathe, but also to reaffirm that this fusion between Steven and Connie is a good thing, just when it's not being corrupted. After their run, Stevonnie will spend the rest of the episode with the teens of Beach City, something that pretty quickly makes what the character represents more than clear. See, while every fusion inherently reflects the relationship between its components, Stevonnie also gives the 12 and 13-year-old minds inside of them a chance to see what life is like with a body that others perceive as significantly older, something that doesn't exactly lead to much of a subtle metaphor. And while the show will keep the character as genderless as they're allowed to, with every teen in Beach City finding them attractive and the character growing facial hair a couple of seasons later, I still think it's fair to describe what the character goes through in their first few episodes at least as most analogous to the stereotypically female coming-of-age experience, suddenly finding themselves desirable for the first time in their lives and having no idea how to deal with that. This initially portrays itself in more innocuous ways, as they remain completely oblivious to how flustered Lars, Sadie, and Sour Cream all are at even just the idea of talking to them, but things quickly get a bit more complicated. At the rave that Sour Cream invites them to, the fusion once again begins to dance in a way that pretty clearly resembles their euphoric run from a few minutes prior, except this time they aren't alone. In less than an instant after they notice how they're being watched, how their expression of their new body is being perceived, all the joy in the character is immediately sapped out. As the show often does with fusions, this is portrayed to the audience through a surreal representation of their emotional state, the walls closing in and the camera portraying the character with less and less flattering angles, as they continuously cry out that this isn't the way it's supposed to feel.
Why isn't it like it's supposed to be?
Enter Kevin. Whereas their first outburst was in response to the fusion mischaracterizing the shock of the crowd, Kevin's intentions are impossible to misinterpret. I'm not really even sure if you could categorize his appearance here as part of the metaphor of Stevonnie, when he's more or less just representative of people like Kevin. The fusion's conversation with him, while short, doesn't waste a single line in emphasizing that Kevin is meant to hit every single note as the villain to Stevonnie's whole accelerated puberty angle, with him seeming indifferent at best to them saying they don't want to dance, not even flinching when Stevonnie points out that they don't even know each other, and just generally being this cartoonish representation of a teenage douche. Throughout their entire interaction, the show makes it as clear as possible that Kevin is solely interested in Stevonnie as a physical being, feeling antsy to end what limited conversation they have so that they can get back to dancing. To Kevin, whatever mind or minds happen to be occupying Stevonnie is irrelevant. Irrelevant in a way that Steven and Connie just can't understand. And within the scope of Alone Together, Stevonnie never really figures out how to deal with the Kevins of the world. Ultimately, the solution this episode has to the fusion feeling uncomfortable in their own skin is for them to cease to exist. A solution that does temporarily work for their components and does get this episode to somewhat of an ending, but a solution that seems equally pointless when Kevin does return. 2 seasons later, Beach City Drift picks up right where the fusion's Kevin problems left off, but this time framed much more through Connie. While Steven has blind, mostly uninteresting anger towards the fact that Kevin is a jerk or whatever, Connie just seems more uncomfortable, if anything, dissatisfied with the fact that Kevin made them feel the way he did and seemingly didn't even realize it. And while their solution to this problem, beating Kevin in a street race, is inherently more reflective of their preteen minds than the form they create when they come together, I don't think the same could be said of the fallout from when said plan falls apart. Of course, throughout this episode, Kevin is doing frankly hilarious Kevin things, but I don't think it's an accident that the episode hardly focuses on that. Sure, the fusion is constantly spinning out based on the last thing that Kevin said or did, but the episode seems almost glued to the fusion. Well, at least it does while they're still together. It's actually during this time apart where I think Beach City Drift peeks through its inarguably sick initial de-imitation to make it more than clear what this episode is trying to add to Alone Together.
Steven, he's the reason we fused.
From the time that Kevin first interacted with Stevonnie to this exact moment, every single thing the fusion has done has been in response to him. They danced to spite him, fused together to teach him a lesson, steal Greg's car to make him feel like a loser. Stevonnie, as a physical form, has become nothing more than a mechanism to interact with those perceiving them. A body that no longer serves anybody but those who wish to take advantage of it. Given both the 11-minute runtime of this episode, as well as the fact that this ostensibly aired on a kids network, the takeaway from all of this ends up being Steven and Connie deciding to focus on themselves and enjoying the view more with Kevin literally behind them. But I just never stopped thinking about the time in between this moment and this one. A time in which Stevonnie no longer belonged to their namesake individuals. A time in which control was taken away and the form felt even more alien than it initially did. I don't really think the show stopped thinking about it either. Mindful Education is a great episode that is entirely fairly talked about a ton. Here Comes the Thought is one of the Steven Universe songs. There aren't 5 episodes of the show that look better than this, it's just obviously an all-time classic that is treated as such. All of that being said, there's still surprisingly little discussion on the actual plot of the episode. From first glance, it's not super hard to find the connection between what Connie is going through at the beginning of the episode and what Steven goes through at the end, as both characters are effectively reeling from the pain they inflicted on others when they really didn't want to. Of course, there is a difference between Connie subconsciously launching into attack mode and Steven acting in pretty inarguable self-defense, but there's obviously a link between these two events that the characters use to help each other get through it. However, what I don't really believe this interpretation explains is what any of this has to do with Stevonnie. Why they're even in this episode in the first place outside of vibes and a reason to have crazy visuals and shit, but I think you can also find that in this quarter hour. On the Connie side, there's not as much of a stretch that needs to be made. Just as the previous 2 Stevonnie episodes featured the fusion feeling out of sync with their body and not fully capable of controlling how others are affected by them, Connie struggles with exactly the same at school. Furthermore, after this display of strength, Connie finds it impossible for people to see her as the person she still feels she is, something that should hopefully sound familiar. Steven's conflict is a bit more inherently complicated. For the sake of the episode, Mindful Education chooses to primarily focus on the fact that Steven has also hurt people and also needs to actually confront what happened instead of avoiding thinking about it. You know, the whole literal song and dance, but none of those ghosts are what I want to talk about. As what ultimately pushes Stevonnie off the edge isn't seeing Jasper or Eyeball or Bismuth, it's the ghost that's been with Steven from the very beginning. Just as Connie feels somewhat misplaced in this newfound body capable of violence, Steven has never fully felt comfortable in a body that carries the gem of the most universally despised being in his universe. Sure, the protagonist of the first few seasons is obviously stoked to be involved in anything gem-related, but by this point in the show, it's pretty obvious that at least a part of him wishes he could be somebody else. That he could wake up tomorrow without carrying the literal weight of what's left of his mother's legacy, weight that also causes him to be perceived in a way he vehemently disagrees with. Just like Connie and the fusion they make together, Steven finds himself constantly at odds with the dichotomy between the person he feels he is and the perception that a part of his physical appearance gives off. Similar to Alone Together, Mindful Education doesn't fully attempt to solve this problem for Steven, instead focusing on moving past the consequences of that problem being the violence that Steven has been forced to take part in. This band-aid on the problem though, just like the decision to unfuse at the ending of Stevonnie's first episode, isn't exactly permanent. On September 21st, 2017, on the Steven Universe podcast, Rebecca Sugar performed a song from an upcoming episode. In the 473 days that followed, the show's fanbase frequently debated which of the characters would ultimately be behind the lyrics. In retrospect, however, it seems pretty damn obvious. Escapism is one of the few songs in Steven Universe that isn't diegetic. While the show is completely willing to let characters sing during fights or arguments or whatever, this song's namesake episode chooses to only attach the song to Stevonnie through the vocal performance, given that the fusion has actually already split by the time that we hear it. Despite this though, it's pretty easy to connect the themes of escapism to everything we've talked about with the fusion, especially since it comes as Steven is literally having an out-of-body experience. Even with it being only 3 sentences, the lyrics sung by Stevonnie here clearly paint the picture of Steven wishing that he could, well, escape from his body, from this massive amount of trauma and pressure that he's literally inherited. At this point in the show, Steven has very little reason to believe that he'll ever get back to his human life, little reason to believe that this gem stuff will ever resolve, so of course he feels desperate for any way he could have a different set of responsibilities, any way he could be somebody else. This connection between Steven's struggle to reconcile his gem and human sides and his physical body is one that continues well throughout Future, with the character finding it harder and harder to associate with his physical form, and said form changing rapidly to fit that perception. The concept of feeling separate from your body is just one that's pretty consistently interweaved throughout Steven Universe's narrative from start to end, and from both within and outside of Stevonnie. Getting back to the fusion though, their appearances throughout the parts of the show we haven't talked about yet generally either involve the character serving to represent the idea of human-gem interaction, such as in We Need to Talk or throughout Diamond Days, or just so that Connie can be more of an active participant in the more action-focused portion of the show, such as Crack the Whip or most of the Lars stuff. There is a pretty interesting use of the character in Jungle Moon as a kind of way to portray the similarities between Connie and Steven's maternal struggles in a more visually interesting fashion, but I don't think that ends up being entirely relevant to this video. Instead, the final Stevonnie moment I want to touch on is what is, as of now, the final appearance of the fusion. Something worth noting first though is that after Beach City Drift, Stevonnie is not formed in front of other humans. Well, at least humans that haven't died and been resurrected. This distinction is ultimately most important when considering what the original struggle of the fusion was, as they spent their first full 2 episodes trying and mostly failing to coexist with their fellow mostly human beings. Anyway, for the vast majority of Steven Universe Future, Steven and Connie's relationship is somewhat struggling, at least from Steven's point of view. Connie has new friends from a new life that Steven feels completely separate from, and his lack of a traditional human upbringing is making joining in that life more than difficult. This disconnect between Steven and a fellow human being because of the parts of his childhood he spent partaking in gem shenanigans is nothing new to the series, but it's never really been portrayed like this before. Like it's somehow getting worse every second Steven doesn't do something about it. It's a suffocating part of what is still somehow one of the lighter episodes of the season, as despite being as physically close to Connie as he could be, Steven feels as alone as, well, humanly possible. It is a shockingly similar setup to Alone Together, but whereas a dance at a sour cream DJ party is ultimately what kicked off the beginning of the end for Stevonnie's first stint, this time it feels a bit different. Obviously, this kick-ass display from Stevonnie does not entirely fix the dynamic between Connie and Steven, as indicated by what occurs in the very next episode, but it's still hard to see it as something other than the fusion finally feeling comfortable in their own skin. Of course, a lot of this comes down to the fact that both Steven and Connie have grown up quite a bit since they initially fused, but I think there's something slightly more to it. The idea that, just for a moment, perhaps just for a single song, Steven has found a sense of belonging in a non-gem setting. A peek into a world where he can be part of a community that doesn't at least partially see him as an extension of the rock in his navel cavity. A place where he can have more control over his body than it has over him. Stevonnie has been on my mind quite a bit in these last couple of months. Obviously, a part of which relates to the aesthetics of the character, both in the good times and in the less than good times, but I mostly just keep thinking about the fusion as an extension of Steven Universe, both the character and the show. A way for the series to explore these ideas of bodily dread and separation from a slightly different, more grown-up lens. A being that is both 50% more human than the show's protagonist, while also only being possible through perhaps the most alien of all gem concepts. An experience that I just... This has been Ample Samuel. Thanks for watching.